Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 25th of June, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson, and my co-host today is Charles Malet. Welcome to the programme, Charles.
Thank you, Mike.
And joining us via live link, we have researcher and activist Sandi and journalist and peace campaigner Vanessa Beeley. Now, we must, quote, actively prepare for the possibility of the UK coming under direct threat, potentially in a wartime scenario, according to the Starmer regime. The statement was made alongside the launch of the shiny new national security strategy. And right on cue, Charles, the legacy media is ramping up the fear agenda once again. For example, the Telegraph here.
Yes, it is. And the Joint State Threats Assessment Team has the risk of an attack to the UK at substantial, in other words, unchanged. But this has not stopped the government and the media from encouraging the population to enter into a state of full-blown panic. And as Mike says, this article from the Telegraph is case in point, referring to plans for annual drills relating to an attack on this country, and indeed the recirculation of the Protect and Survive literature from the 1970s and 80s. And quite deliberately, this coincides with the publication of the new national security strategy, linked also with the messaging coming from the NATO summit. The central theme here to this document is that we're all going to war, which makes it the government's version of the recently published Strategic Defence Review for civvies. The Prime Minister writes a forward to the document based on the faulty premise that the world has become more dangerous, a passive statement without an active plan, about an active plan. But of course, what he means is that the actions taken by his government and their strategic partners have created enough chaos to suggest that war is imminent. And to that end, quote, we must also now mobilise every element of society towards a collective national effort. Now, the persistent themes are, as much as you might expect, the sense of peril conjured by allusions to the threats presented by Russia and Iran, among others. The strategy posits that, quote, national security today means so much more than it used to, from the health of our economy to food prices to supply chains, from safety on the streets to the online world. End quote. Describing this as a strategy should raise a trade descriptions flag, because the one thing it fails to do is to set out any sort of definitive plan. The language used might be described as woolly and conceptual, and exactly like the Defence Review, the key takeaway from this paper is that the United Kingdom is in absolutely no way prepared for any kind of shock or pressure on its supply chains or lines of communication. Now, at the same time as creating the spectre of a deadly enemy with which to justify such a strategy, it does at the same time confirm to that enemy that the country is in a parlous state, which one might describe as an interesting strategy. Now, the NATO summit, which Mike will cover next, has predictably seen much focus on the technological side of things, with Zelensky continuing to go on about drones and their funding. And this coincides with a piece in the latest issue of Soldier magazine about the compatibility of the deployment of autonomous drones and the laws of armed conflict. Now, this is prompted by the recent launch of the American Red Dragon suicide drone, which is built by AeroVironment, and their promotional video is playing at the moment. The key feature of the development, as referred to in the article, is the, quote, AI brain, which means that it can be configured to take on a fully autonomous mission where it selects and eliminates an enemy target on its own with no human operator in the decision-making loop. And it goes on to say that the use of such technology is, quote, difficult to foresee, end quote, which really means it's a question of when. And for context, these systems are widely used already. Here's another manufacturer's promotional video, Elbit. Elbit, of course, an Israeli firm supplying a lot of technology into the British defence infrastructure already, and a key enabler of the destruction in Gaza, which further raises the fundamental issues of autonomy in the overall context of command and control. Now, Mike will speak about the Americans retaining control of nuclear weapons carried by British F-35 airframes, but purchasing kit from nations which take a particular view on the interpretation of the laws of armed conflict must, by definition, expose a tremendous vulnerability in that area. And the last thing to consider is the potential fallout from overblowing the confected threat. Now, as I said at the outset, the government, under the false pretext of intelligence, is trying to convince the public that there really is an existential threat to the UK. Now, in addition to stoking the nuclear fear, they determined there to be a specific threat of a drone attack from Russia or Iran in particular. Now, the National Security Strategy says, in specific reference to such a drone attack, that some of these technologies will be available to a wider range of threat actors, posing new challenges to the traditional concepts of deterrence and escalation. Now, the Telegraph, again, is happy to do the state's bidding, and here's a headline from earlier in the week. The question for Joe Public, then, is how to determine what is or is not a threat. Now, all of this drone threat signalling coincides with Amazon's plan to launch their Prime Air capability. And this is really not meant to be a flippant point. But if you tell the public to be terrified of everything, then you have to own the consequences.
Well, thank you, Charles. Let's move on then to the NATO summit. And that kicked off yesterday in The Hague. Just like the G7, it has a shortened format and there'll be no communique. The summit was supposed to be 3 days in meetings. These have been replaced with 2.5 hours during the course of today. The rest of the time is being spent in informal discussions, as we'll see in a minute. It's us against the world was the key message, with Mark Rutte saying, quote, "We meet at a truly historic moment with significant and growing challenges to our security as the world becomes more dangerous." The language is consistent right across the board here. Ally leaders will take bold decisions to strengthen our collective defence, making NATO a stronger, a fairer and a more lethal alliance. This will include a major new defence investment plan, raising the benchmark for defence investment to 5% of GDP, he said, a concerted effort to ramp up defence industry across the alliance, bringing not only greater security but also more jobs, and a continued focus on support for Ukraine, alongside the pursuit of a just and lasting end to Russia's war of aggression. The language from him is incredible. He went on to say, and once again, I'm saying this, in fact, and once again, he couldn't help himself because he said, all of this is essential to keeping our 1 billion citizens safe, because remember, that's the first role of government, right? This was a theme repeated several times in his opening remarks. And another key theme was the threat of a Russian invasion of NATO within 5 years or so. That's the claim anyway. Now, try not to laugh, but he said, quotes, "There's widespread agreement within NATO that at this moment today, if Russia would attack us, our reaction would be devastating, and the Russians know this." There you go. Now, Keir Starmer then, during this, went on to speak to French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz on the sidelines of the NATO summit. This was yesterday evening. The readout that they published says that they agreed that now is the time for diplomacy and for Iran to come to the negotiating table. I'm sure Vanessa will have something to say about that in a second. On Gaza, Starmer demonstrated once again the lack of an original thought. And he said that the situation on Gaza is intolerable, that all sides need to work towards an urgent ceasefire. And on Ukraine, they were again banging the same old drum. No innovative ideas from these three stooges. More pressure on the Kremlin is what they said, including through further sanctions. There'll be no discussion between the three. There'll be more discussion between the three of them this evening, and I'm certain with equally riveting results. Now, also at the summit, Starmer announced that Britain, as Charles has alluded to, will be purchasing 12 new F-35A fighter jets, which can carry both nuclear and conventional weapons, and that Britain will join NATO's dual-capable aircraft nuclear mission. This decision is going to support, they said, 20,000 jobs in the F-35 program in the UK, with 15% of the global supply chain. The jets based in Britain, they said, supporting highly skilled jobs and opportunities for working people and delivering a defence dividend across the country. So what more could we ask for? But in other words, what they're saying is that jobs are reliant on killing people in perpetual war. So these new fast jets, as they're described, are going to be based at RAF Marham, with the government expected to procure 138 F-35s over the lifetime of the programme. And again, try not to laugh. They said that the procurement of these 12 F-35As, rather than choosing 12 F-35Bs as part of this current procurement package, will deliver a saving of up to 25% per aircraft for the taxpayer. So, yes. But here's the rub. As Charles mentioned, the nuclear weapons to be used on these aircraft are controlled by the United States. So how does that work, Charles?
Well, I think this is one of the very many big questions about all of this stuff that's being put out. I have absolutely no idea, and especially when one considers what's been happening in the Middle East over the last week or so, it should be a massive point of contention, and yet this is apparently just gone straight over the hurdle, and everybody seems to accept it.
Yes. Now, Sweden, moving on a little bit, but also related to the NATO conference, Sweden has now announced that starting on the 1st of July, its Navy will stop, inspect and potentially seize all suspected vessels transiting its exclusive economic zone and is deploying the Swedish Air Force to back this up. Since the combined maritime economic zones of Sweden and 3 Baltic states cover the whole of the central Baltic Sea, this amounts to a virtual threat to cut off all Russian trade exiting via the Baltic. This is according to Mats Nielsen on X. Now, he goes on to say that would indeed be a very serious economic blow to Moscow. Just to put this into a bit of context, here's the map of the area. So I guess what we're talking about here is this particular region here. And of course, the biggest threat here as far as Russia is concerned, aside from the fact they can't get into the North Sea, is it would cut off potentially Russia's enclave of Kaliningrad, which, as you can see from the map there, has Poland, but also the Baltic states around it. It's effectively landlocked. So any attempt to restrict or stop Russia accessing that from the sea would mean that they're cut off from all resources. But to just point out Kaliningrad there with the arrow, if you just put that back on screen for a second. Thanks, Stephanie. So there we go. That's the situation. Now, this has been reported in non-mainstream news outlets like Energy News, but also here in Euromaidan Press. In Nielsen's comments, he went on to say this is the kind of action that's traditionally led to war. The Swedish assumption seems to be that the Russian Navy and Air Force in the Baltic are now so weak and so surrounded by NATO territory that there's nothing Moscow can do about this. However, it's very unlikely that the Swedes would take this step unless they also believe that in the event of a clash, Washington would come to Sweden's defence, even though the EU and Swedish decisions are made without US approval and are not strictly covered by NATO's Article 5. But Vanessa, surely this is why Sweden was bullied into becoming a NATO member in the first place. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on this.
No, I mean, it is extraordinary, but yes, I would agree that this is one of the reasons that Sweden was forced to join the cartel. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, well, let's come to you then and give us an update on what's been going on between Israel and Iran. Everybody knows that the bombing has apparently stopped in the last 24 hours, but where actually are we at the moment?
Well, I mean, there was a lot of confusion over the ceasefire, and there are many complexities to this conflict that I'm not going to be able to cover in their entirety today or on the news, but we can continue in extra. I think I'm going to highlight some of the most important failures in the narratives from the West, particularly from Trump and his administration. But first of all, the news came in this morning that Iranian parliament has voted to suspend cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency. The bill prohibits entry of IAEA inspectors unless security of facilities is guaranteed. Of course, as the foreign minister in Iran did point out, the bombing of the nuclear facilities is effectively a violation of UN Resolution 487 that was established after the bombing of the Osirak alleged nuclear reactor in Iraq back in 1981, and is really a violation of the IAEA itself. 222 votes in favor, no votes against, and 1 abstention. So clearly, very, very sort of decisive vote. Now, if we have a look at what Donald Trump was saying, he basically claimed that the US strikes over the weekend have completely and totally obliterated Iran's 3 flagship nuclear facilities at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. So let's have a look and see how correct that is. So this was in I-24, which of course is Israeli-linked media. Experts are questioning the extent of damage to the Iranian nuclear sites following the US strikes. And then on I-24 Hebrew TV, there was an interview with a specialist whose name I haven't been able to identify because it was all in Hebrew and on video, not on transcript. But he said the Iranian Fordo nuclear facility can only be destroyed from the inside. Let's stop with the illusions and fantasies. It can only be done from within or with hundreds of bombs dropped one after the other. So very interesting, totally countering Trump's claims at the weekend. And then this was interesting. This was published yesterday by Alistair Crook, of course, former MI6 with connections. He worked extensively in Israel itself, but he basically makes the point that the key nuclear allegation that started the war was coaxed from a Palantir counterintelligence algorithm. So let's have a look at what he points out in the article itself. Since 2015, the IAEA has relied on Palantir's Mosaic platform, a 50 million AI system that sifts through millions of data points, satellite imagery, social media, personnel logs to predict nuclear threats. He goes on to say that Mosaic is not a passive system. It's trained to infer from its algorithm hostile intent. When repurposed for nuclear oversight, its equations risk translating simple correlation into malicious intent. Now I just want to play, because what I've been noticing since Israel began the aggression against Iran, there have been a lot of Iranians going onto social media to make points and to stand in solidarity with their government, their army, and the Republican Guard. And this is just one of them. Very intelligent points being made here. We can just play.
آیا ایران به لبنان حمله کرده؟ نه، این اسرائیل بود. آیا ایران به سوریه حمله کرده؟ نه، این اسرائیل بود. آیا ایران غزه و کرانه باختری رو بمباران کرده؟ نه، این کار رو اسرائیل کرده. آیا ایران به یمن حمله کرده؟ نه، اسرائیل حمله کرده. آیا ایران به مصر حمله کرده؟ نه، اسرائیل حمله کرده. آیا ایران به عراق حمله کرده؟ نه، این اسرائیل بود. آیا ایران دانشمند ترور کرده یا به کشورهای دیگه مثل تونس یا سودان حمله کرده؟ نه، اما این کارا رو اسرائیل کرده. آیا ایران در اردن حمله هوایی انجام داده؟ خیر، ولی اسرائیل انجام داده. آیا ایران عملیات مخفیانه توی لیبی انجام داده؟ نه، اینم اسرائیل بود. و با همه اینا آیا ایران حق داشتن سلاح هسته‌ای رو داره؟ نه، دنیا میگه حق نداره. اما اسرائیل چی؟ اسرائیل بمب هسته‌ای داره؟ بله، چرا که نه، در خفا بدون هیچ نظارتی، با محافظت و سکوت.
I think very pertinent points made there. And I think one of the general consensus since the so-called ceasefire has been that Iran has largely been victorious in this war, both from a propaganda perspective or from a PR perspective and from a military deterrence perspective. And this is from an Iranian professor who's a very well-known commentator on X in particular. So she's basically saying they haven't won or lost the war. It's she sees it only as a temporary pause. And she talks basically about how the war itself has demonstrated Iran's ability to defend itself and to develop its military infrastructure despite 40 years of sanctions. She also talks extensively, not only in this post, about the cohesion, the national cohesion across the population of Iran. And we've certainly seen demonstrations of millions of people out on the streets, including those that before might have been against some of the policies in Iran itself. And she goes on to say, and again, I've actually also highlighted this in some of the writing that I've done, we are now aware of our shortcomings more than ever and in dire need of some changes. So this is a realistic analysis of what the war has revealed to Iranians. Iran's biggest achievement or gift wasn't on the battlefield, but at home among the people becoming as one. this is a very important point. The younger generations who had not experienced that during the revolution or the 8 Years' War, which is the Iran-Iraq war, now tasted something beyond themselves. It gave them the identity they were longing for. I know Iranians won't get how profound that is, non-Iranians, sorry. But the enemy understood this very well and planned accordingly. Our biggest challenges will be inside the borders from now on, but it's still hybrid warfare, and there are many open fronts, and I'll talk about that in my next section. But this is another video from a journalist at German channel ARD, Sophie von der Tann, speaking about the Israeli censorship on the Iranian strikes inside the occupied territories. So let's have a look at what she had to say.
Then there are restrictions, military censorship. And according to these rules, we are only allowed to film and report if civilian targets were hit, residential buildings, for example. But if military or strategic targets were hit, we are not allowed to film and report unless we get the approval of the censor. The military censor says that's because that's sensitive information that Iran is not supposed to get. But the problem is that that can create the impression that only civilian and no military targets are being aimed at and hit. And with regards to Gaza, the problem is that we've been barred by Israel from entering Gaza independently since October 7, 2023.
So extraordinary levels of censorship inside Israel, and it's now sort of going to probably slowly be revealed the number of intelligence personnel, military personnel that may have been hit in the multiple strikes across the occupied territory. It's also worth pointing out, she mentions that independent journalists can't go into Gaza. There is a recent Harvard study that has been published in the last couple of days that is now saying that more than 377,000 Palestinians are now unaccounted for inside Gaza. That's 17% of the population before the 7th of October, 2023. On the contrary, from Iran, we've seen very sort of detailed coverage of the deaths of both scientists, paramedics, and military personnel, particularly the command of the IRGC. If we can just have a look at this slide. This was in about 24 hours before the ceasefire came into effect. A martyred Iranian scientist, Dr. Sayed Mustafa Sadati Amakji, and his entire family were killed in an Israeli strike on Iran. So that was very shortly before the ceasefire. And there was a nuclear scientist, Mohammad Reza Siddiqui, who was also killed in the period just before the ceasefire. Now, this is an interesting point. It comes from Wall Street Journal, but it's something that I've also been saying. Israel seeks to wrap up fighting with Iran soon, but my argument is that Israel is only going to accept a ceasefire and the US is only going to accept a ceasefire because it's of advantage to them. And many analysts are basically saying that Israel was basically starting to run out of its interceptor missiles. Many of its air defense systems were seen to be failing on the videos that were coming out of Israel itself. And I would say it's worth saying that there may be a point, just as when Israel signed the ceasefire with Hezbollah in Lebanon, they pivoted to Syria. So there is potential that we're going to see, for example, a pivot towards Lebanon, the potential for triggering Takfiri attacks on Lebanese soil to occupy Hezbollah before they restart the conflict with Iran. And finally, I just wanted to say this summarizes really the consensus on social media that really people have gone from believing in the negative propaganda against Iran into really considering Iran with a great deal of admiration, respect, and awe as a result of their ability to both deter Israel and to do serious damage to Israel.
Thank you very much for that, Vanessa. Lots to unpack in extra on that report, so thank you for that. Let's welcome Sandi to the program. And Sandi, we are witnessing this continuing ramping up in fear in the UK, the justification for war in other countries, and we have to just keep the pressure on the idea of in people's minds, or at least keep the idea in people's minds, that this regime that we are experiencing in this country may have an ideology that we're not altogether familiar with.
Absolutely, Mike. I've just been looking really this week because last week was a very dark week, as we mentioned, with the passing of the assisted dying bill and the decriminalisation of full-term abortions. All of this can lead to blurred lines between legislation and potential use, sort of abuse of power. And Liz Evans gave an excellent presentation of this last week about what the abuses could be with these new bills that have come in. I've been looking at history, and it's always a good marker for what's happening now, as a hidden hand always kind of bounces back to take control. And this time it's under Agenda 2030, depopulation and genomic data gathering. And I see a pattern emerging with what's happening in the Fabian and Eugenics Society in the early part of the century. And bearing in mind we have 141 members of the Fabian Society in Parliament right now, including Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves. And I've got, a slide here with Kim Ledbetter, who led the Assisting Dying Bill. She's a member of the Fabian Society. Now, their emblem is the wolf in sheep's clothing, as we saw earlier, and their method is slow infiltration and propaganda by incrementalism. And, when they strike hard, they strike hard. They've got the tortoise emblem as well, which I think Ben has mentioned. We've got tortoise media. It's all in there. Later on in the show, I'll be drawing parallels to what happened then and what's happening now, because there are massive parallels, and history does teach us, and it always bounces back. And let's see what George Bernard Shaw, the founder of the Fabians and the members of the British eugenics movement, said about the right of disabled and mentally infirm people to life in the 1930s. Now, Ben showed this last year on UKC, and it's even more relevant now in the light of the recently passed bills. So if we can just show that video of George Bernard Shaw.
You must all know half a dozen people at least who are no use in this world, who are more trouble than they are worth. Just put them there and say, sir or madam, now will you be kind enough to justify your existence? If you can't justify your existence, if you're not pulling your weight in the social vote, if you're not producing as much as you consume, or perhaps a little more, then, clearly, we cannot use the big organization of our society for the purpose of keeping you alive, because your life does not benefit us, and it can't be of very much use to yourself.
Yeah, it's quite shocking, really, isn't it? I mean, this is the kind of ideology that we're seeing almost being reborn in the UK at the moment, and it's really disturbing. And I just wanted to just point that one out, really.
Thank you, Sandi. Thank you for that. And it is a good point. We've got to look at history and see where these policy agendas are coming from. And assisted dying, the full-term abortion, warfare. It's all the same kind of expression of the same kind of policy.
It is. And on the Fabians, there's a very good article by Gloria Moss on the UK Column website about exactly this. So do have a look at that.
Okay, if you like what the UK Column does, have a look at the ukcolumn.org website. There's a link there to take us to our support page. We do need your support, your ongoing support, and I want to say thank you very much once again to everybody who is continuing to give that. And you can join as a member, you can make a donation, you can buy something from the UK Column shop and so on. Very much appreciated for those that do, and if you're not, please consider it. Quick reminder of Brian's interview with Debbie Richens yesterday, parental alienation. That is on the website at the moment. And tomorrow, Brian will be speaking to an anonymous voice from Israel about some of what's going on over there. Now, if you'd like to join us on Saturday, the 18th of October, 2025 in New York for the next On Location event, the topic is going to be health. And we suspect we're going to be announcing a keynote speaker in the not too distant future. Tickets will be on sale at the end of July. So we're going to be asking you to wait until then for those, but there's a reason for that, which we'll announce shortly as well. Now, this weekend, of course, we'll all be at the Sounds Beautiful Festival and in Wimborne and Dorset. So if you can get to that, I think there's still tickets available. Do get along to that. Hopefully the weather will be good. And Sandi, very, very briefly, celebrating freedom of speech in Glastonbury.
Sorry, could you say that again?
Celebrating freedom of speech event.
Yeah, we're doing the freedom of speech event. It's finally happening because we got banned from every venue in Glastonbury because we're speaking about land grab, and particularly the World Heritage status pitch for Glastonbury, and they don't like that being said, and they're finding every reason to ban me, calling me all sorts of names. But we're going ahead with it.
Oh, yeah. Okay, super. So that's Friday the 4th of July, and that's 7 to 10 p.m. In the Village Hall in Glastonbury, and also Regional Sovereignty versus Devolution on Sunday the 20th of July. Sandi will also be speaking at that, and the details on screen and will be in the show notes. Andrew Bridgen will also be speaking at that event as well. But Charles, let's move on then to energy.
Yes, indeed. And another day, another clean energy plan. Despite the misleading vocab, the government is determined to unleash what it describes as a tidal wave of jobs in the sector, which sounds rather alarming. Much of this is to rubber stamp the so-called spending review, but in reality, it represents the reworking of the net zero plan. Now, though Ed Miliband continues to bang the drum for his solar panels and wind turbines, it's increasingly clear that nuclear power is to be given a more central role as the government finally concedes that it cannot force the sun to shine at night or indeed make wind turbines turn without wind. Now, one of the beneficiaries in terms of funding is Tokamak Energy, shown here, which is to embark on a joint venture with the Japanese firm Furukawa Electric Group, and they will take a slice of the £2.5 billion being thrown at fusion energy technology. On the nuclear fission front, Sizewell C has been pushed on, but with limited fanfare. And the reason for the muted announcement are because they show up the push for so-called green or clean renewable energy as totally absurd by any metric. Now, it's reckoned that Sizewell will make a grid contribution of around 3.2 gigawatts, which would be equal to around 7% of the UK's current demand. And a few weeks ago, I spoke about the creation of another of Miliband's brainchildren, GB Energy, which is hoped to deliver 5% of the UK's energy by 2030 at a cost of over £8 billion. Now, the comparison could hardly be more stark. Sizewell should cover an area of less than 1,000 acres, and it will deliver a stable supply of energy around the clock, whereas GB Energy, conversely, may require more than 100,000 acres to deliver an intermittent supply of energy, which at its peak will still be less than that delivered by nuclear at Sizewell. Now, this all indicates that the narrative is collapsing, and in a mark of desperation, Emma Pinchbeck of the Climate Change Committee is adamant that a financial nudge is needed to move people onto clean technologies by artificially dropping the prices of energy from such sources and then loading taxes and tariffs onto so-called fossil fuels. Now, Pinchbeck's proclamation is set against what might be regarded as a record-breaking calculation from the World Weather Attribution of the recent summer weather in summer. They've said that due to man-made climate change has made such events about 100 times as likely, occurring in June only once every 2,500 years before industrialisation. And to reinforce the point about the desperation, the government has rather sheepishly back down from the much vaunted foisting of smart meters upon the population. This month marked the cut-off for the old-style RTS meters, but this has been quietly extended with no deadline. The announcement says that they will, quote, pursue a phased approach, beginning with a very small number of homes and businesses in carefully targeted local areas. And I would say all of this just goes to show that resistance to these sorts of meritless and controlling schemes does work, and that you, the people, hold the power, literally.
Yes. Okay. Well, Sandi alluded to this earlier, but every baby is going to have their DNA mapped under an NHS revolution to predict and prevent diseases, and this is according to the Daily Telegraph. And since Health Secretary Wes Streeting retweeted their tweet, I guess that's confirmation. Now, Streeting said the advances in genomics would allow people to, quote, leapfrog killer illnesses and receive personalized healthcare. And within a decade, every newborn will undergo whole genomic sequencing, according to the Telegraph, which assesses the risk of hundreds of diseases. Now, that's the claim, and the Telegraph reports that this proposal will be part of a 10-year health plan, which is expected to be launched in the first week of July and will be funded by a £650 million boost into genomics as part of the government's life sciences sector plan. But since we don't live in a democracy, but are rather run by a uniparty, David Cameron was straight out to applaud here in this tweet. Fantastic news, he said. Now, the 10-year health plan will define how so-called healthcare is delivered in the future from hospital to community, from analog to digital, and from treating sickness to prevention of illness. Of course, this has nothing to do with preventing disease before it happens, as is claimed. It's everything to do with looking for markers which will get people into a lifetime of big pharma intervention from the age of 0. But it doesn't end there. It's also about digital ID. Your genomic sequence will be used to generate a unique identifier which will follow you from cradle to grave. This is where digital ID ends up. And as the Trust report here says, we're entering the age of DNA IDs. So don't forget, we warned that the Data Use and Access Bill was the enabler for all this. So if you're unhappy about it, it could have been prevented with an organised campaign perhaps, but this legislation has now received royal assent as of 5 days ago. And so the brakes are off. And let's not forget who's right at the centre of all this. It's Palantir, already mentioned on this programme and already fully embedded in the National Health Service. Palantir is in a prime position to benefit. Now, does anybody on this discussion today or on this news programme believe that Palantir is doing this to save lives? Do you believe Palantir is doing this to save lives?
I don't think so. And I don't think this should be regarded as separate from all the sort of war, NATO, fear narrative as well. I mean, it's very, very reminiscent of the way the COVID system, charade, whatever one wants to call it, was driven. Everybody now speaking the same language, and it doesn't really matter whether it's war or health. It all is all tantamount to the same thing, a control mechanism which yields enormous financial dividends for those who are controlling it.
And Sandi, related, again, remind us of a little bit of history, and this time Hollerith.
Yeah, I mean, the eugenics movement goes back a long way, originating really in the UK and the US before it happened in Nazi Germany. But Herman Hollerith was an engineer, and he developed a tabulating system, a sort of punch card system, which was almost like an early computer, which eventually was acquired in advance by IBM, and it was instrumental in the categorization and processing of health and racial data in the 1930s, particularly in the census of 1933. Now, Edwin Black's extensively researched book, IBM and the Holocaust, he documents how IBM, through the company DHOMAG, provided tabulation machines and technical assistance to the Nazi regime. This helped the government sort census data, including religion, ancestry, and health data, and enabled the identification of racial demographics and the disabled and mentally ill, and others who were targeted under eugenics laws. IBM New York maintained control over this company, DHOMAG, and approving leases and punch card customization and upgrades. Now, there's a distinct parallel to what's happening now with NHS Digital, NHS Improvement, and Genomics England, Palantir, all of that stuff, and as a means of collecting health data on the population. And this links up with Mike's what Mike said about the baby DNA harvesting of newborns, and Ben's article on Monday about the company Illumina and Netanyahu's involvement with Israeli genomic sequencing industries. Now, in 2022, the Health Secretary and Social Care announced that NHSX, NHS Digital, will merge with NHS England and NHS Improvement. This new technology is predictive, preventative, and personalised and participatory medicine. The NHS at its core will be working around genetics in disease, reaching into the DNA of every man and woman in the UK. The use of this app has the ability to monitor every aspect of your life, your shopping habits, financial and social status, education, hereditary, genomics, fitness, and more, feeding into the corporate superstate created by COVID-19, that crisis, and it's powered by mass surveillance. According to NHSX, from 2020 to 2025, genomic medicine will be embedded into routine care. When we look at the new legislation for assisted dying and abortion, we see that what was once a covert operation in the 1930s has become overt and acceptable. Now, I want to look at Action 4. This is the Nazi program in the 1930s and 40s for the euthanasia of people not deemed to benefit society. So the question is history repeating itself?
That is a good question. And Vanessa, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that before you move on, but do you want to talk about biodefence?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think I'll just go straight into the biodefence because it's all connected, and it's quite amazing how Trump is effectively handing over the management of the United States of America to Palantir across all sectors of security and military and health and so on. But this is something that a friend of mine pointed out to me in the last couple of days. So this is the bipartisan commission on, sorry, I can't actually read that, of biodefence, I think, helping to defend the United States against biological threats. Now, this is quite an extraordinary subject once looking into it very deeply. And of course, what I've said, there's a reason for the ceasefire between Iran and Israel. And of course, we always have to be looking at the next step on the roadmap and what exactly are they going to put into effect to restart the war or to somehow change the direction of their strategy. But their strategy remains the same, in my opinion, which is to effect regime change in Iran. So this is a 170-page document, the National Blueprint for Biodefence. The link will be in the show notes. Immediate action needed to defend against biological threats. And so what does it identify exactly as those biological threats? This is something that Charles will be very interested in seeing on this. So this is the Biodefence Blueprint. The world stands in a partial state of vigilance, reeling from COVID-19, struggling with Mpox, fighting malaria, acknowledging the possibility of biological terrorism. By implementing this national blueprint for biodefense, America can once again rise to the challenge and save lives. It's not over. Extremely dramatic. And not forgetting, of course, that the year-end budget for 2025 for the biodefense program is $52 billion. That's the proposal that Trump has put through under his administration. So basically, this is part of a conference that was held in May 2025. It's the first annual State of National Biodefense Address. And this Dr. Asha M. George is basically talking about the State Department records on countries that present a threat of biological terrorism. So let's just have a quick listen to what she has to say.
We've gone from one or two sentences about China and Iran now to entire paragraphs about China and Iran. Russia and North Korea. They have not yet come out to say that China and Iran also have offensive biological weapons programs. They have, however, talked about everything else they can talk about. They have said that they have no proof now that the historic offensive biological weapons programs that those two countries had, that we knew they had, ever ceased. Now, if you think about it, that particularly with China, that's a long time program. That goes all the way back to World War II and probably before then.
So, I mean, what you have here is the framing of a potential for a false flag attack, of course, probably on American soil if it's going to happen anywhere. You have July the 4th coming up, which might be a little bit too obvious. I think people might spot that one. But it's interesting, the 4 countries that are mentioned, of course, China first, then Iran, and then suddenly North Korea and Russia are inserted into the dialogue without any evidence whatsoever that they have an offensive biological terrorism strategy anywhere in the world. Neither has Iran. I mean, Iran, this has not been mentioned before, but it's very interesting that 1 month ago it was being brought up at this first session of the Biodefence address.
Yeah. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, we were sort of wetting ourselves during
Yeah,
that.
I mean, well, it's a gift. It's like a ghost story. The less you see, the more scared you're liable to be. And I think that's the remarkable thing about the suggestion of any biological threat, bioterrorism, or whatever it is. And if you do need to demonstrate it, and Ben pointed this out on Monday, it only needs to exist on a computer, exactly like in the way that the genomic sequencing of what was called COVID-19 was run. So once that exists, people believe that it's there, and it doesn't really matter whether there's any tangible effect on the ground. That's utterly beside the point. But the ability to drive the narrative forward based on absolutely nothing is always there, which is remarkable, but true.
Okay, well, let's change the topic then and look at what the City of London has been up to.
Yes, indeed, because yesterday was the 24th of June, and that was the feast of the Nativity of St. John the Baptist, observed by very many denominations of Christians and also referred to as Midsummer's Day, which is of great significance to Freemasons. Now, in 1717, the Grand Lodge of London and Westminster, which is now the United Grand Lodge of England, was formed by Freemasons on St. John's Day. Now, this remains the date upon which the 2 sheriffs of the Corporation of the City of London are elected each year, a timely reminder of the tangled web woven across the architecture of the state. Now, the corporation's website explains that the City of London sheriffs play an important role both in promoting and enhancing the rule of law and links between the City of London Corporation and the judiciary at the Old Bailey. Now, this year's sheriffs-elect are Robert Hughes Penny and Keith Bottomley, both with very long-standing links to the machinations of the city at home and abroad. And as the press release notes, they act as, quote, ambassadors for the UK-based financial and professional services industry by promoting the UK as a place in which to do business, end quote. So exactly what sort of enhancements is the rule of law benefiting from, one might ask. Now, with regard to the Old Bailey or the Central Criminal Court, quote, the City of London Corporation owns and administers the building. The department also handles security, maintenance, and deals with the administration of the shrievalty, which includes execution of writs and warrants. Now, the sheriffs are presented with their warrants and the sovereign's writ of approbation by the King's Remembrancer, shown here on screen with the Lord Mayor, current Lord Mayor Alistair King. And it is here that the interplay between these characters becomes highly questionable. Now, the King's Remembrancer acts as conduit between the city, the Lord Mayor in particular, the royal household and Parliament, and in order to fulfil some of these duties, and as you I'm sure may already know, the Remembrancer, a post currently held by Paul Wright, sits directly behind the Speaker of the House of Commons, from where he is said to have no influence on proceedings, due to the fact that he's not permitted to access the floor of the House. He is, however, there to keep a record of proceedings which may have a bearing on the corporation of the City of London, a privilege not afforded to any other body or organisation. However, since he's also able to give evidence to committees when there are matters concerning the city, it's clear that this line is blurred, to say the least. Now, the Remembrancer has the ears of the Lord Mayor of London, the Corporation of the City of London, the Speaker of the House of Commons, and the Sovereign, all at the same time. And on top of all of this, the Remembrancer sits on the executive leadership board of the corporation, which is, quote, responsible for aligning strategy and connecting plans across all the organisations which make up the City of London Corporation. Now, also on the board are, among many others, the Private Secretary to the Lord Mayor, but particularly the Director of the City of London Police Authority and the City of London Police Commissioner. Now, this is hardly a new problem. Disraeli saw it in 1875, and he certainly hasn't been the only one. But he said back then during a debate, in regard to the office of the Queen's Remembrancer, the House is aware that the Judicature Commission recommended that the office of Queen's Remembrancer should be abolished, and afterwards there was a Treasury minute on the same subject, which bound the government to take some steps in the matter. Now, needless to say, 150 years on, nothing was done, and the corruption persists.
Okay, thank you, Charles. So let's move on then. Back to you, Sandi. And you were talking a couple of weeks ago about the festivals that are going on. Of course, Glastonbury starts immediately. And what is going on with festivals around the country?
Well, it's interesting. At the moment, there's a lot of festivals going on in London. Obviously, we've got Glastonbury Festival this week, which has doubled its profits from last year. And it's always been a bit of a contentious thing because it's becoming more and more corporate, and Evis has entered his 90th year, and he's handing the baton over to his daughter, Emily Evis. But they've come under a bit of criticism from Neil Young. I mean, he's been very vocal about it being corporatized over. And he said we were told the BBC was now a sort of a partner in Glastonbury, and he wanted us. They wanted us to do a lot of things in a way we were not interested in. It seems Glastonbury is now under corporate control, and not the way I remember it. So that's Neil Young's take on Glastonbury, and I think it's probably about right. But we do have this thing where in London, a lot of the local councils in London are taking over parks for the benefit of putting on big, large events for profit. And over the last few years, this has been expanding steadily. And there's an accumulative total of about 140 days of ticketed music festivals and concerts planned across London parks for 2025, up nearly 14% since last year, according to analysis by the Financial Times. Now, this is really councils, bankrupt councils trying to make money because they haven't got enough to maintain the parks, apparently. So those festivals and councils, revenue generating strategies are on unsteady footing after a High Court ruling last week by planning judge Tim Mould-Casey found that Lambeth Council's decision to grant permission for events hosted in Brockwell Park was unlawful after a legal challenge was brought about by local residents. The Protect Brockwell Park campaign argues that the council has been prioritising for-profit events that reduce local access to the parks. And this, it causes damage to the ecology and contributes to neighbourhood noise and pollution. But despite the ruling, the festivals in the park are going ahead. Of course, nobody takes any notice of the people. So Lambeth Council announced late on Thursday that it had approved the certificate submitted by the organisers. They've refused to say how much they'll gain from festivals this year, but an FOI request revealed that the park generated more than 500,000 of revenue in 2023. London Council, a governing body that represents the capital's local authorities, has estimated the total funding shortfall for all 32 boroughs is 500 million this year. So I think Victoria Park are making a revenue of about 1.6 million, and similar events at Alexandra Palace and Finsbury Park and many other local parks in London. As access to parks and green spaces is not considered a statutory requirement, councils are under no legal obligation to provide park services. So people simply, that's what they're looking at. They're looking at a sort of, a wall of green fencing if they want to go to their park. So this is quite interesting, and it shows the kind of, the ridiculousness of a lot of the sustainability stuff that local councils put out, but they don't adhere to it when it comes to making money.
But Sandi, I think the main problem for the councils at the moment is that they're basically all bankrupt. They're scrabbling around trying to find every penny that they possibly can because they've been asset stripping the councils for so many years now. And this is the reason that this is, well, one of the reasons this is massively important, apart from the impact that it has on the ground in local communities, is because this is part of the restructuring, the constitutional restructuring of this country. And the changing in the nature of councils. But of course, once we start seeing the likes of Sadiq Khan and Andy Burnham appearing on the scene, the chances of local voices being heard becomes that much smaller.
Yeah, exactly. And it'll only get worse with devolution. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, thank you, Sandi. Okay, let's move on to this then. The UK column has been publishing a website on spending by the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office for a little bit of time now, and the latest spending data has been added to that website. Now, the reason that this website was created in the first place is because the FCDO produces documentation on its spending of in amounts over £25,000, but it comes in a spreadsheet form, which is pretty inaccessible to people. You can't search it, and you can't search historically and so on. So we decided we would make that data available in a much more accessible way. So the data on that website is now up to date as far as the latest statistics are going, and that brings it up to January of this year. Now, if you haven't looked at the site yet, please do so. And as I've made the point before, it does do a great job of highlighting how much money is going to a host of organizations, but it doesn't give any indication of what the money is actually being spent on, because the FCDO doesn't provide that information because it's completely opaque. But if we look at the front page again, just for the final time here, you'll see there most of the way down that front page, the top 20 beneficiaries of FCDO money. And if we have a look at some of these, we find that vaccinations are clearly a key priority. So let's look at three of the line items here. We've got £1 billion going to the has gone to the Global Fund to Fight AIDS and TB. £1 billion has gone to the Gavi Vaccine Alliance, and £350 million going to an organisation called IFFIM. Now, I'm quite sure most people won't have heard of that. So what is it? Well, it's a vaccine Ponzi scheme run through the World Bank. It was created as a development financing tool to help the international community achieve the Millennium Development Goals, to quote from the paragraph that's on screen at the moment. Money is pledged by governments, in this case, France, Italy, Norway, South Africa, Spain, Sweden, and the UK, and is used as a basis for vaccine bonds, which are then sold on the markets to raise private funds, which are given over to Gavi. So that's the situation with that. If we come back to the FCDO spending website and have a look at how much money is being spent by them on a monthly basis, we can just see how much more the spending has ramped up since the start of the Ukraine war. I find this graph quite amazing, Charles, because the data begins in July 2016, and still quite large amounts of money, 400 million being spent per month. But as we've got to the last couple of years, we've seen a couple of months there where well over 1.5 billion per month being spent, and one month actually approaching 2 billion. So it is quite incredible how much money is being spent through the Foreign Office, but we've no right to know specifically what it's being used for.
Absolutely. And I would say, particularly with the NATO summit in mind, it's probably set to continue because, of course, Mark Rutte making the distinction in order to hit the 5% target between the 3.5% requirement for what they were describing as core defence spending and then the 1.5 on sort of other stuff, undefined. And it's not beyond the bounds of possibility that the FCDA might be shouldering some of that, but also this comes hot on the heels of that report that I'd mentioned earlier in the Lancet, which suggests that there is a decline in vaccine uptake across the world, particularly since 2020. So no doubt some serious lobbying's gone on behind the scenes in order to get these handouts through the system.
Finally.
So, yes, finally. Now, if you were in any doubt about the role of Hollywood and the entertainment industry in the shaping of public consciousness, we'll finish the programme with a look at Tom Cruise shaping the recent strike operation in Iran from his mass media vehicle Top Gun Maverick from 2022.
The target is an unsanctioned uranium enrichment plant built in violation of a multilateral NATO treaty. The uranium produced there represents a direct threat to our allies in the region. The Pentagon has tasked us with assembling a strike team and taking it out before it becomes fully operational. The plant sits in an underground bunker at the end of this valley. Said valley is GPS jammed and defended by an extensive surface-to-air missile array, serving a limited number of fifth-generation fighters, which in turn are backed up by a plentiful reserve of surplus aircraft, even a few old F-14s.
Seems like we're not the only ones holding on to old relics.
What's your read, Captain?
Well, sir, normally this would be a cakewalk for the F-35 stealth, but GPS jamming negates that. Surface-to-air threat necessitates a low-level, laser-guided strike, tailor-made for the F-18, I figure. 2 precision bombs, minimum, makes it 4 aircraft, flying in pairs. That is one hell of a steep climb out of there, exposing you to all the surface-to-air missiles. Or you survive that, it's a dogfight all the way home.
There we are, no doubt. He's on Pete Hegseth's Signal messaging group.
Must be. We will be talking about that in extra as well. So join us if you're a UK Call member in a few minutes, but we've got to leave the news there for today. Thanks for everybody that's watched. Join us for extra if you can, but otherwise, see you Friday, 1 p.m. as usual. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.